Metric 2 covers the work that we do within Forest. And so there's several activities or approved project activities that fall under this metric category. And these include wetland or upland fire preparation, which correlates to Code 2.1 specifically, wetland and upland prescribed fire, which includes 2.1 through 2.5, planting native upland vegetation, which covers all of the metrics underneath here, and upland vegetation management, which is universal metrics only. And so during this video, we'll walk through what you would need to monitor on each of these different activities. For any fire preparation work we do, which usually consists of raking or maintaining fire lines, is going to need to have universal photo point monitoring, as well as our other universal spatial extent monitoring that falls under Code 2.1 here. And I'll show you an example in just a second, but instead of taking a large polygon track to walk the perimeter of the area for fire lines, we encourage you to take length and width measurements. Here's an example of why I encourage everyone to take length and width measurements instead of just taking a track of walking all the way down a fire trail or fire lane and then all the way back again, getting the perimeter. If we take a close look at the beginning of this track of the fire line trail, you can see that there's a pretty distinct line here. And notice also in this imagery that there's not a whole bunch of canopy cover in this area. That's really going to be important as to why we can't always just take a perimeter for tracking fire lines. Once we move further down that track, you'll see that we start to get kicked around a little bit, and notice again that the imagery so if you were in the field, the trees and the canopy cover would start covering the connection for your GPS to communicate with the satellites in space, and that's what's going to have us get kicked around when we're walking in an area that's very close to each other. Some of those points are going to connect and not read accurately, so we're not going to come up with that. Really, we're going to have an inaccurate acreage. If we collect both the length and width measurements and multiply them to get the product of our area, this is going to give us a much better accurate depiction of the acreage that we worked. And so when you're out in the field, your team, instead of walking the perimeter all the way down the fire line and then walking all the way back on the other side, you simply would need them just to walk a full way down just to get a line track. Before we move on to talking about actually prescribed burning, just a recap on fire preparation. Again, we're just collecting photo points and the activity area or spatial extent with those length and width measurements. And so for the photo point, we're going to do that before and post restoration. But when we're collecting for that spatial extent, we only need to collect the length and width once the work has been completed. If we were actually to apply prescribed fire, we're going to do codes 2.1 through 2.5. So again, 2.1 is again that spatial extent. Of course, we're going to have our universal photo point metric as well. And then we'll have 2.2 through 2.5 as our ecological sampling metrics. So 2.2 refers to basal area. If you look into the bottom right corner of this slide, you'll see basal area refers to taking the DBH or diameter of circumference of a tree at breast height and converting that to basal area. We will also do canopy cover using a variety of different phone apps. There is percent ground cover. You can see a group doing this in the image in the middle. And they also collect leaf litter depth when they're conducting that percent ground cover as well. Because this activity has such a large spatial extent, there is a very rigorous monitoring protocol which means we need a lot of materials to be prepared to do this work. And so you can see on the screen, you're going to need a lot of items to bring with you to complete these sample plots and collect all the information. That includes the Metric 2 forest sheets, at least one Quadrat, a couple PVC poles, the phone applications, one for photo points, and then one to conduct canopy cover, a ruler to get the leaf litter depth, a diameter tape or DBH tape that you should be able to get provided from your partner to conduct DBH measurements to measure basal area. Of course, a GPS unit, and not only one but two long measuring tapes. And I'll get into why two is going to really come in handy in just a moment. To collect all of this different criteria, we're going to establish a sampling plot and multiple sampling plots across the total project activity area. But in each of those sampling plots, you're going to do the basal area, leaf litter depth, percent cover, and canopy cover, as well as the photo point. And so here's a diagram of what that would look like. The first thing you're going to do, just like with any other activity, is go ahead and establish a photo point. And that photo point is going to be the center of our sampling plot. So you can have that point established already, use your GPS, walk out to it, and before you even walk out any measuring tapes to start with a photo point, you can have that place marked and go ahead and take a canopy cover photo. Once you've gotten the canopy cover done, you can go ahead and start walking out a line 27.5 feet to complete a transect to walk the first reference pole out to take a photo point. So in this example, we did that walking to the south and also walking to the east. And so the best way to do this is, again, have two long measuring tapes, so we're able to really establish that central area to work in and collect this information, because you'll see that there are the little icons of trees represent the trees that we would take the DBH to calculate basal area, and then the quadrat represents the leaf litter depth and percent cover. Once we've collected everything we need to from that first segment in between the south and east in the southeastern quadrant, we can go ahead and move up to the northeastern quadrant and do the same procedure. So we can just pull up that transect or long measuring tape that we walk down to the south and go ahead and walk it up to the north and take that photo point and do our DBH measurements and percent cover and leaf litter depth in the next direction. And you'll do this in each of the 4 quadrants of the circle to complete the sampling area. To learn how to conduct each of these methods, please refer to the rest of the training under the Metric 2 forest in the Google Classroom. For 2.2, there is a best practices for measuring DBH video that relates to basal area. For 2.3, for canopy cover, please read the instructions for downloading apps and their use. And for 2.4 and 2.5, please watch the estimating percent cover video. Next is planting native upland vegetation. Most of the time when we're planting vegetation in a forested area, it's going to be considered an upland. There are occasions, such as bogs, that are considered wetlands, so technically it would be considered planting native wetland vegetation. But we can talk through that filling out pre-restoration worksheets. But the process for any type of planting vegetation is the same across the board for upland and wetland. And so you'll see for upland vegetation, we're going to follow 2.1 through 2.6. And so this could vary depending on what your project partner wants to do, if they don't want to collect all that additional information. But most of the time that we are planting, such as longleaf pines, is when an area has been timbered or just completely wiped out of trees. And so they're trying to really get an idea of what's going on and how the habitat's doing. And so focusing on 2.6 here, since we haven't covered that yet, we're going to count the density and height of planted native species. And so on here I've put a sample from the data sheet for native upland vegetation, and you're just going to put the species. You're going to do an absolute tally count of that species within that plot area, and then you're going to want to get an average height of all the saplings of those trees. And so you can put the different heights on here and then do an average at the end of that. And you'll also want to add some density notes if you see maybe there's, you know, a whole bunch of saplings that aren't doing too well, that have died since the last time. But also you're going to want to do this both before and after. So before, there probably won't be any saplings, but there may be mature trees of that species. If we're planting pines, for example, you can see here in this image that there are a few pines potentially in that sample area. So we want to track that as well. Our final activity that falls under the forest metric is upland vegetation management, and again there could possibly be wetland vegetation management if we were doing something related to bogs. So for this activity, it's not listed in the guidebook because it's a little bit funky of an activity. So upland vegetation management refers to the activities that you do before you would do the planting. So that could be growing the plants, possibly collecting seeds for propagation, maybe working at a nursery to build plant beds and then plant some of these plants before you get out there. So for this activity, you just need to collect photo points of the work that is done. No spatial extent is needed, and really just note the number of plants grown or the ounces of seeds propagated, plant beds built, etc. So we can get that numerical value.